So the horrors of the siege of Jerusalem. The horrors of the siege of Jerusalem. Josephus goes into many details. I think he wrote over 200 pages on the siege of Jerusalem. I only gave you a few chapters, right? Not many by Josephus. But there's more to read. The Roman war forced many in Jerusalem to seek refuge. Okay? Or to seek refuge into Jerusalem, right? Because the Roman war kind of climaxed in the Jerusalem siege. Well, it kept going to 166, but that was like the climactic event. But there were several other battles beforehand. And people ran to Jerusalem for safety. Okay? And there was all kinds of unseemly people who came. Right? The zealots, everyone was kind of worried about the zealots because they might be someone that could be someone who erupts at any time kind of thing, right? But also, Josephus records murderers and thieves came into the city as well. So you get a lot of people who are just seeking refuge from the war. Zealots, we find, tortured and killed over 12,000 nobles and famous citizens. And those who tried to escape had their throats slit and their bodies were laid in the streets. Josephus says this, the noise also of those that were fighting was incessant, both day and by night. But lamentation of those that mourned exceeded others. They, moreover, were still inventing somewhat or other when they had resolved upon anything. They executed it without mercy and omitted no method of torment or of barbarity. And because it was Passover, many Jews came to Jerusalem before the siege. This made the death count climb. The death count only went up from that. And it made food more difficult to find as well during the siege. The Roman armies burnt all the the granaries in Jerusalem, and they poisoned the water going into the city. So food's running out quickly, and all the water's poisoned. Josephus writes this, the madness of the seditions had also increased together with the famine. And both those miseries were every day inflamed more and more, for there was no corn of which appeared publicly. It was now a miserable case, and a sight that would justly bring tears into our eyes, insomuch as children pulled the very morsels out of their fathers were eating out of their very mouths, and so did mothers do to their infants. People began selling their homes to get food. After that, they sold their children. People regularly ate from public sewers, cattle and pigeon dung. They ate leather shields, they ate hay, they ate clothes. The things the dogs wouldn't even eat on the ground. And if anyone was thought to have food, they were killed, tortured and killed. Josephus again writes this, it was therefore impossible to go distinctly over every instance of these men's iniquity. I shall therefore speak my mind here at once briefly. They neither did any other city suffer such miserable, nor did any age ever breed a generation more fruitful in wickedness than this was, from the beginning of the world. And some would try to sneak out of Jerusalem to hunt, right? Because the food's getting scarce on the inside. But they were captured by the Roman armies. They were crucified outside of Jerusalem. Josephus records that there was a time when 500 new people per day were crucified on crosses outside of Jerusalem. Josephus writes this, room was wanting for the crosses, and the crosses wanting for bodies. So many crosses all the way around. There's no more room for more crosses. But they still wanted to crucify more. Titus ordered the walls be built around Jerusalem to prevent anyone from escaping. Luke records the same event as Matthew 24, and he says this, for the days will come upon you when enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side. And this only made the famine worse. The walls that were built around Jerusalem. Can someone read this quote for us? Thank you. So Josephus tells of one woman who killed her son, roasted his body, and ate half of him. And she hid the remaining half. When the smell drew others who were desperate for food, she offered to share the other half of the body. That was the famine. Then, finally, the walls of Jerusalem were breached. And over a period of many months, they worked their way to the temple. Remember, Jerusalem was broken up into 3 different sections, right? So they broke in through, on the east side by the Mount of Olives, there was a massive valley. So they couldn't come in that side, so they came in from the west side. Through a section of the city. As the city expanded, they kept building walls around it, right? And so they broke through the first section of the wall pretty quickly. I think it was about 3 months they broke through the first section of the wall. But the Jerusalem forces kept pushing back, and there was a second layer of wall that was right in front of the temple. And the Jews decided actually to dig under the temple and attack on the other side of the wall. In fact, they lit fire to many of the Roman siege weaponry. But that fire and the tunnel would not serve to help them for long. Can someone read this quote? The blood outnumbered the fire. The slain outnumbered those who slew them. The ground did not appear visible anywhere because of the dead bodies that lay on it. When the soldiers went on a number into the lanes of the city with drawn swords, they slew those whom they overtook without mercy, and set fire to houses where the Jews had fled, and burnt every soul in them, and laid waste a great many of the rest. And when they had come to the house to plunder them, they found in them entire families of dead men, and the upper room full of dead corpses. And that is such as died by famine, that they then stood in horror at the sight, and went out without touching anything. But although they had this commiseration for such as were destroyed in the manner, yet they had not the same for those who were still alive. But they ran everyone through whom they met with the obstructed the very lanes with dead bodies, and made the whole city run down with blood to such degree that the fire of many houses was quenched with these men's blood. We find that Josephus records 1.1 million were killed in Jerusalem. 100,000 survivors were sold as slaves or made gladiators or went in Titus's procession back in Rome. Caesar gave orders to these men that they should now demolish the entire city and temple. And it was so thoroughly laid, even with the ground by those that dug up its foundation, that there was nothing left to make those came thither believe that it had ever been inhabited. That's what Jesus predicted, right? Not one stone will be left unturned. The war which the Jews made with the Romans had been the greatest of all those, not only that have been in our time, but in manner of those that ever were heard of. Both of those within cities, wherein cities have fought against city and nation against nation. Accordingly, it appeared to me that the most misfortunes of men from the beginning of the world, if they be compared to those of the Jews, are not so considerable as they were. The Jews were revolting. So you can read about this in Josephus especially. But yeah, the Jews were revolting against the Romans. Remember, even during the days of Jesus, you had the Zealots, right? They were revolting against the Romans. And ultimately, the Romans decided to squash this. Like, we're not gonna keep taking this, Well, the war continued to 166 AD, but 70 AD was the kind of the decisive battle that marked, okay, this thing's going downhill. Read 1st and 2nd Maccabees. Yeah, read 1st and 2nd Maccabees. So look at verse 21. This is the good question to ask. This was bad, right? There was so much blood, it was putting out the fire. 1.1 million people died. The bodies of the dead outnumber the bodies of the living. Actually, it records, I guess I don't have the quote, when when Titus went into the temple, they had to, like, there were bodies all inside the temple, and even on the altar itself, that they had to throw off of it from both sides. It was bad. But you have to ask the question that was already asked before, which is the right question. Can we really use language like verse 21 to describe it? It was bad, but can we really use language like verse 21? For there will be a great tribulation such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. Can we really use language like that? Talk to the person next to you. Think about it, and think about your Bibles also. Have you seen language like this before? Can we really use language like this? Certainly these events seem to be what we're reading about, right? These events seem, like, we follow the logic of the text, but verse 21 is the verse, right? So, you know how many were killed in the Holocaust? How many Jews were killed in the Holocaust? 6 million, 6.6 million. The Pol Pot genocide in Cambodia? Don't forget about that. Can we really use language like this to describe 70 AD? Yeah, Daniel 12 verse 1 talks about it. That's good. James?
The Exodus.
The Exodus, yeah. Solomon is described like that. That's exactly right. So here's the point. The Bible uses language like this to describe judgment often. Exodus 11:6. There should be a cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there has never been, nor ever will be again. Exodus 9:18. Behold, about this time tomorrow I will cause very heavy hail to fall, such as has never been in Egypt from this day, from the day it was founded until now. The locusts came up over all the land of Egypt and settled on the whole country of Egypt, such a dense swarm of locusts as has never been before, nor ever will be again. What about Joel 1 and 2? Remember Joel? What's like the story of Joel when it starts? There's like the swarming locusts, and when the swarming locusts have left, the gathering locusts have, like, names like 4 or 5 different kinds of locusts, right? So if Ezekiel was like a big temple nerd, Joel was like a locust nerd. I don't know of many kinds of locusts personally, but I think it's 4 swarms of locusts just keep coming in, which seems to be more severe than the locusts we see in Egypt. Okay. Joel 2:2. A day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness, like blackness there is spread upon the mountains a great and powerful people. Their like has never been before, nor will there ever be again from after them through the years of all generations, describing deportation of Judah. Talking about the Babylonian captivity. And because of all your abominations, I will do with you what I have never yet done, and like what I will never do again. Ezekiel 5:9. It's not lying. It's used. This is the kind of language that's often used in judgments. Daniel 9:12. He has confirmed his word which he spoke against us and against our rulers who ruled us by bringing us this great calamity. For under the whole heaven there has not been done anything like what has been done to Jerusalem. That's describing the deportation of Babylon. And of course in Daniel 12:1 we see the same language, right? So the Bible often uses language like this to describe judgment, but it's also used in non-judgment texts, okay? And this is maybe what's the most convincing to me. Hezekiah. Can someone read this text about Hezekiah? But of course Jesus is better. But more than that, when we read this account of Josiah, the exact same language is used. Can someone read this verse? And of course, Jesus is better than Josiah. Also, what about the Hezekiah text we just read? So this is just common language in the Bible to describe a great climactic event. So conclusion on this, it's hyperbolic language stressing the greatness of the judgment against Jerusalem. It's not a literal statement describing judgment as the worst possible in human history. Moreover, if this were describing the tribulation of the end of the world, it would, get this it'd certainly be odd to say nothing like this and nothing that ever will be, right? Like if it's describing the events of the very end of history, why would you say there won't be anything worse than this because it's just done right there, right? It clearly, we have to read it within the Bible's own language. Symbolic description of the destruction of the temple, verses 29 through 31. This is the debated section. This is the debated section. But I think it starts with immediately after the tribulation of those days, right? I don't think that. I know it starts with that, right? It starts immediately after the tribulation of those days. So option 1, the events of 15 through 28 do not describe the destruction of the temple, right? That's option 1, and after the tribulation of those days is describing a future event, right? Option 2, Jesus is predicting the second coming in fullness happened at the same time as the destruction of the temple. That's the full preterist view. This is saying Jesus will come back in 70 AD in finality. That's option 2. Option 3, there's a gap between the events of 15 through 28 and 29 through 31. So the tribulation of those days refers to a different tribulation of different days. Option 4 is a symbolic description of judgment against Jerusalem. I think it's option 4. I think it's option 4. Again, eschatology is hard, but I really do think it's option 4. We've seen language like this used before to describe the judgment against nations, right? Stars falling from heaven. Isaiah 13 describes Babylon, stars falling from heaven. This is just day of the Lord language, I think. It's day of the Lord language that we've seen before. Does that make sense? I feel like we've talked about that already. Okay. It's using the same language as the Old Testament. The hosts of heaven will rot away and shake up like a scroll, and all their hosts fail. Can someone read this by William Campbell? R.T. France says this: if such language is appropriate to describe the end of Babylon or Edom under the judgment of God, why should not equally describe the judgment of Jerusalem's temple and the power structure that it symbolized? I think it's describing the falling of the kingdom of man. I think it's the kingdom of man is falling and the new creation is coming in Revelation. Or throughout world history. It could be throughout world history. It could be final judgment. But either way, I don't think it's literal stars falling from the sky. We have to read it with all that language coming up. Some people think it means that it's describing 70 AD, Revelation. I'm less than persuaded by that. Do you think that the events of Revelation all describe the second coming? Okay. Yeah, so we agree it can't describe the second coming then. But I think that the reason it is described that way in the gospel accounts with the apocalyptic language is not because it didn't literally happen, but because it was showing that it's a fulfillment of day of the Lord language. I think that's what it's doing. Now there was certainly signs that happened over Jerusalem also. Josephus records that. But Jesus talks about signs in the heavens and stuff, but not stars falling. I'm inclined to read it like I read the rest of those accounts. And the gospel accounts is just simply using that kind of language to describe the death of Jesus. It happened literally, but... Okay, so the coming of Christ. The coming of Christ, we already saw in Daniel 7, was Christ coming to the Father to receive the kingdom. This is not a description of the second coming. It's a description of the ascension. N.T. Wright, again, is helpful. This coming refers to an event whereby the authority of Jesus is vindicated over the Jewish establishment which had rejected him. Sam Storms is helpful when he says this: the vision is not about a descent from heaven to earth, nor about the second coming of the Son of Man at the close of history, but rather a vision of the Son of Man in heaven, coming to the Ancient of Days, God the Father, to receive his kingdom. A new kingdom, a new and everlasting dominion is being established to replace the failed regimes of the previous empires. Again, Matthew 24, 30 through 31 is not about the return of Christ at the end of history, but about his enthronement as King of Kings and Lord of Lords in the very middle of history. I think that's right. I think that's right. We already saw the Daniel 7 language, but in case you forgot, the Son of Man, clothed in power, goes to the Ancient of Days. He goes on the clouds of heaven. He doesn't come down to earth. He goes to the Father. And I think it's an ironic use of Daniel 7, right? So whereas Daniel 7, the Son of Man represents Israel and leads them to triumph, here the Son of Man, when he comes to receive the kingdom, destroys Israel. The sign of the Son of Man, I don't think this is a reference to a sign in heaven, as if there's a supernatural cosmic event in heaven. I think instead it's the sign that the Son of Man is in heaven. It's the sign that the Son of Man is in heaven, which is the destruction of Jerusalem. The destruction of Jerusalem is the sign of the Son of Man being in heaven, that he is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. he's enthroned. The tribes of the land, the tribes of all the earth, I don't think it's a reference to all the people on the earth. If you look at the original quotation from Zechariah, it's talking about the tribes of the land of Israel. So I think the Zechariah prophecy is fulfilled in the tribes of the land, not all the peoples of the earth. I think that makes most sense with the quotation. So the messengers, or the angels, right? Angelos could mean angels, or it could mean messengers. I think it probably means the messengers. I don't think he's talking about angels gathering the elect. I think it's a reference to messengers who go and preach the gospel. After Jerusalem falls, he goes out and gathers the elect, meaning the gospel is preached to the ends of the earth, north, south, east, and west. That's my best guess. If it does refer to little angels, it could be angels that help in the preaching of the gospel. I'm not inclined to think that. I think it just refers to people who preach, which that kind of language is used elsewhere in the Bible. And I think this is describing the preaching of the gospel after 70 AD. So I don't think the verse 31 is describing the events of 70 AD. It's referring to after 70 AD. So after it's all been destroyed, the gospel goes out. And that's why I think verse 14 is describing the preaching of the gospel after 70 AD. Because both these sections end, verse 14 and verse 31, end with, there's all these judgments. In the first section is the sign of the times, but the end doesn't come then, which the end is, I think, what they say, when you're coming in the end of the age, right? These all talk about the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds. This refers to the end of the age. And then here, it refers to the end of the age as well. Yeah, so I don't think it's describing 70 AD. I think it is describing the same event as the parable, and it's happening at the end of the age, which has not occurred yet. It's a good question. The trumpets, it's not a reference to literal trumpets, like the trumpets that John describes in Revelation, I don't think. I think it's referring to the year of Jubilee. The year of Jubilee has finally come. Because we're talking in the context of a Daniel 7 allusion, right? So Leviticus 25:9, can someone read that? Okay. It's saying that I think it's a reference to preaching the gospel. Gathering the elect is not the rapture. I don't think it's the rapture. And if it were, it'd be post-trib, right? Not pre-trib. Instead, I think it's gathering the elect that occurs at the second coming of Christ, or until the second coming of Christ. From now or from 70 AD to the second coming of Christ is what it's gathering them. Luke 13:29 uses similar language. I will gather from east and west and north and south and make them recline at the table of the kingdom of God. And Deuteronomy 30 uses that language of gathering back in to describe returning from exile. Right, so I think we can read 2nd Exodus, return from exile language there. For me, the Daniel 7 quotation is the governing factor in this text. The Daniel 7 quotation, we all agreed, is not about the second coming. Right? It refers to the coming that happens during the fourth kingdom in Daniel 7. Right, and I think that this is using the same thing as Daniel. So whatever the timing of the other events are, we have to say, I think, the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds fulfills the Daniel 7 text, right? That's the debated text. That's the debated section. That's my view. You don't have to agree with it. The Daniel 7 quotation is the controlling factor for me, and I figure everything else out after that. The cursing of the fig tree. And also, we'll get there. But the sign itself, you know that summer's coming when you look at the fig tree. It's not supposed to be a prophecy that Israel's reconstituted. The interpretation is that all these things, Jerusalem surrounded by Roman armies, know that it is near, referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. Heaven and earth refers maybe to the temple itself, or maybe to literal heaven and earth. But the temple was the cosmos, so it could be that. But the audience is, truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. This generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Which is why I think this is describing the destruction of the temple. The final coming of Jesus is in verses 36 through 51, I think. This is when the second question is answered. The second question is answered. I'll take the question in a second. What's the sign of your coming, and how do we know the end of the age is upon us? This is the sign of the end of the world. This is Jesus' final coming. It starts with but concerning that day or hour. Not even Jesus himself knows when it's going to occur. Right? Not even Jesus himself knows when it's going to occur. The sign of that time is different than the sign of the destruction of Jerusalem. The sign here is not catastrophe, but it's normal life. It's going to be like the days of Noah. We're all just kind of living our normal lives like in the days of Noah. We see the same thing in 1 Thessalonians 5. When people are saying there is peace and security, then suddenly destruction will come upon them as labor pains upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. Right? The second coming, the final coming of Jesus is not coming at a time when there's all these signs happening. It's in a time of normal life. Luke 17:20 through 30. Likewise, just as of Lot, when there was eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building. But on the day when Lot went out from Sodom, fire and sulfur rained from heaven to destroy them. So will be when the Son of Man is revealed. Right? People are just partying and living a normal life. Sam Storm says this: when will Jesus come? Jesus will come when his coming is the farthest thing from people's minds. Jesus will come when his coming is the farthest things from people's minds. So I think the lesson of the fig tree is the transition. So we finish a whole section that I think naturally flows, because verse 29 says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, which I think is referring to the great tribulation we saw before. And then we say, from this fig tree learn the lesson, because you can tell when summer is near from the fig tree, right? So you can tell when the destruction of Jerusalem is near, given what I've just said, okay? Then we get to, this verse 36 seems to be a very different kind of event. Now concerning that day, it's no longer referring to, I think, the day that he just described. He's talking about a later day. The hour no one knows. So the first is talking about this generation, right? And we've clearly done a transition. Here, let me finish what I'm saying real quick. We've clearly had a transition in verses 32, 33, 34, and 35. Jesus has said, he's given us a parable of a fig tree. But this day, no one knows. So the first one, you can discern when it's here. This one, no one knows when it's coming. In fact, everyone's going to be living a normal life. Everyone's going to be living a normal life, eating and drinking. It's going to be like the days of Noah. They were unaware until the flood came and swept them away. That does not describe 70 AD. People were aware of what was going on all around them. So I think that this is describing the second coming, and there's other language like that in the New Testament. Yeah. That's right. Yeah, now he's talking about the second coming. Yeah, because the signs of that day are very different than the signs that Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. The signs that Jerusalem is going to be destroyed are evident, and you can tell because look at the fig tree. You know when summer's coming. When you look at the fig tree, you know summer's coming. But about that day, no one's going to know. Everything is going to be great. It's going to be like in the days of Noah, and no one's going to be aware that it's coming. So I think we're talking about a very different time. We're talking about which is why when Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 5, that day's not going to overtake you and surprise you, the elect. But the world who's in darkness, it will overtake and surprise them. Because no one's, when Jesus comes back, I think the principle is this: when Jesus comes back, it's not going to be a time when people are thinking, Jesus could come back any second. It's going to be a time when people are just living normal life. No, I think you can tell the day and the hour, and that's what Jesus has just spent so much time arguing. You can tell when it's coming. That he gave a sign when you see the abomination, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, which we find that Titus actually pulled his armies back for a time and Christians fled. So I think that when you see this Jerusalem surrounded by armies, get out, you can tell, but you can tell the day or the hour, right? If you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you can tell. And Jesus said it's going to happen in this generation. Is the word season used? It's talking about like season of summer and stuff, right? But where are you getting the word season from?
Yeah,
learn the lesson, as soon as this branch becomes tender, puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. Right? So he's saying, that sounds like the day or the hour to me. You know that summer is near as soon as you see the fig tree blossom. So he's saying, you know the destruction of Jerusalem is near when you see it surrounded by armies. I think that's what he's saying. But of the coming day, no one knows the day or the hour. In fact, people are going to be unaware until the flood came and swept them away. That certainly doesn't describe 70 AD, I think, because everyone was like, there had been 3 years ahead of the destruction of Jerusalem of Jewish war, and everyone knew the Roman armies were marching there. And then they saw Jerusalem surrounded by armies, right? So I think the lesson from the fig tree is Jerusalem, and then 36 on is the second coming because of that. It just has a very different tone. And then we have the parable of the wise servant and the 10 virgins, which I think are both describing people who are not aware of when the day comes, right? So let's put the parable of the servant who beats his other servants. He doesn't know when his Lord is coming, right? Let's put that in the context of Jerusalem. He's beating his fellow servant. I don't know when my Lord's coming back. In the meantime, Jerusalem's being surrounded by armies, and there's trumpets, and it's loud, and there's dead bodies everywhere. I clearly can't be describing the same thing. And then the parable of the virgins, I think, is describing, that one's less so, but it's describing the need for endurance because Jesus' return could be later than you think, which doesn't sound like in this generation. That sounds like it's a time frame. If I knew his return was in this generation, I would bring enough oil for this generation. But if it was going to be 2,000 years later, then I need to bring enough oil in my lamp. It's a very good question. And again, Matthew 24 is one of the hardest texts. Yeah, it's very hard. It's very, very, very hard. The Daniel 7 quotation is my controlling interpretive. The abomination of desolation, spoken about Daniel 7. So that's Daniel 9 and Daniel 7 and Daniel 8. Makes me think that this is describing the event in which Christ's kingdom was confirmed against his enemies.